So usually what we do in the fall of the year to separate the fish and know who's going to reproduce is we isolate the males in one side of the dividers and the females on the other side of the dividers, and then the middle areas where we're working with fish that are ready on the day that we take their eggs.
Mm-hmm. So when they're divided like that, do they actually have any interest in each other?
They have a lot of interest in each other.
It's kind of cruel then, isn't it?
It is.
It's like a chaperone prom. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. We're going to make some fish on today's show. We're in Orland, on the shore of Craig Pond, right where Craig Brook runs into Craig Pond, which is why this federal building is called the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery. It's dedicated to Atlantic salmon. And if you thought all they were doing was hatching eggs and dumping fish into rivers, think again. Chris Domina is hatchery manager, and he's about to give us a close look at what's happening in here. We're starting out right at the entrance. It's a modern brick building with a large statue of a leaping salmon outside. A museum is the first door you pass, the only museum of its kind in the United States, with memorabilia from New England, Old England, and Canada. We'll go in there later. Watch your step. The parking lot is icy, and there can be water in the floors. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Doors, Equipment, and EBS. At one time, Maine's rivers were so full of Atlantic salmon that it was said you could walk across the river on top of them. But our rivers were also good at making hydropower. And over more than a century, we constructed a lot of barriers to fish passage. Salmon heading upstream kept running into one damn thing after another. When they stopped making babies, we stopped getting those big runs. And then we stopped getting even the little runs. Eventually, those dams became obsolete, and we got better at constructing fish byways. The only problem was there wasn't enough big fish to make little fish. It's an old problem. This hatchery has been here in one form or another since 1889. But today, you should see what they're doing inside. Well, hear what they're doing inside. I've got two microphones. I'm holding one. Hatchery manager Chris Domina has the other, and here we go.
So we're at the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery, and we're down in one of our incubation rooms where we've just completed our spawning season for this year, and we've taken over 5 million eggs.
Now, as I look at this, I'm seeing 4 large tanks, large as 8 feet, about 8 feet in diameter?
Yeah, 8-foot circles.
Mm-hmm. And what are these used for?
Well, in this river, which we have 7 different river systems that we work to restore salmon on. Mm-hmm. We're in the sheep's gut room, and in this room we use several different stocking strategies to try to restore the fish to that river. The tanks that you see are where we raise about 15,000 young par every year, mm-hmm. and this is where we would culture those fish.
Okay, at least
they're empty at the
moment.
They're
all empty, okay. Why?
What we do is the eggs that we have incubating right now in the incubation stacks over here to our left, mm-hmm. We'll keep about 15,000 of those eggs, which won't hatch until about March. And as the fish grow, we start to spread them into more of these tanks. But we'll stock these next August. They'll be about 3 or 4 inches long in the freshwater stage of an Atlantic salmon's mm-hmm. life cycle.
So essentially what I'm seeing here is these big 4 vats in the middle of the room, a smaller gray tub over in the back of the room, and trays with water flowing into them or through them over here in the right side of the room. And those are where the eggs are currently stored or being incubated, or what?
Yes, being incubated. So
let's take a look. How do you incubate something that's cold?
So each tray has 1 female's worth of eggs in it, so that could be anywhere from 1,500 eggs to 10,000 eggs. And we have genetic information of all the parents of these fish. The trays keep a nice constant flow of cold water over the eggs, and so mm-hmm. they get lots of oxygen as they develop. A female in the wild would lay her eggs in a red, which is a shallow depression in the gravel at the head or the tail of a pool of water. And these stacks sort of simulate that in that they have plenty of current and flow over them the whole time they're developing and growing in the tray.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're in the sheepscot room. You have 8 different rooms, I guess, for 8 different rivers. What's the difference?
So that's a good question. We can tell genetically the parents of each of those rivers. We treat each stock as a river-specific stock. So any fish that come out of that river and we put back in that river are native to that river. It's kind of hard to say if there's what true differences there are between the fish in each river, but we feel like there is differences and we want to let Mother Nature decide that. So we treat each river as a river-specific stock and treat it as its own entity.
Well, my recollection, because I've dealt with this subject before, is that salmon raised in a river get to know that river, and when they go out to sea and come back to spawn later, they can follow the scent or the particular nuances of that individual stream, and they will go back to that one.
That's true. The word we use is imprint on the river, their natal river that they're born in. So we try to either stock, a lot of these fish will be stocked as eggs. They'll actually be planted as eggs into the river, so they get to hatch into the river. As the fish grow and develop and become a smolt, that's the life stage where the fish is ready to migrate to the ocean. And that's when we feel they imprint on the river and will return to that river. And as you said, it's either a scent or something draws the fish back from the ocean to that river. And we don't get a lot of straying between rivers. They tend to home back to their home river.
So when I look at the trays here, they're being treated just with regular water. There's no sheepscot water mixed in there to imprint them.
There isn't. Here at our facility, we hope the imprinting stage occurs when they smolt, as they get to be an older fish. So we're trying to get the fish out before that stage. All of our water here is from the Craig Pond, which is a nice, deep, cold water lake that feeds the water to the hatchery.
Now, you've got all these eggs here, and at this point, each tray has maybe 10,000 eggs in it?
It does.
And I'm counting something on the order of 133 total trays?
Yes. In this room, we actually used 133 females. Some of the other rooms, it could be more than that or a little bit less than that, but this will equate to about 400,000 eggs.
Yeah. Now, to coin a phrase, that's a lot of eggs in one basket. What can go wrong?
That's a good question, too. We have a lot of fail-safes, a lot of alarms. What could go wrong is the water stop flowing or get clogged up, and then we'd have a problem. But we have many safeguards, and that hasn't happened for a very long time.
But it has happened.
It has happened, yes.
So these eggs are going to sit in these trays for how long?
They will stay in these trays until they hatch, or we
dump them in the river.
Dump them in the river as eggs. If we dump them in as eggs, it will happen in about mid-January. About mid-January, we'll stock out the eggs, and then the fry won't be stocked until next spring. So they may stay in the trays till next spring.
A sensitive question: when you dump these eggs into the river, what eats them?
Pretty much everything that eats fish. Yeah, exactly.
So you're going to dump a lot of eggs in hopes that some of them survive.
Yes. We've helped increase the survival of the fish by having such a controlled environment with the spawning and taking away predation at the early stages. And with these eggs, we'll get about 85% of them to survive to the point where they can be released. And in the wild, that number might be as low as 15% survive up to that point where they hatch and can
on the
become
other
young
hand,
fish.
that's very good. If you get 15% of each, let's say there's 10,000 eggs in one tray. If 15% of those ever become fish, that's actually a lot of fish.
That is.
Okay.
That is.
So overwhelmed with numbers.
Yes, that's a good approach, is overwhelm the...
Okay. So we're looking at trays full of eggs right now. We still have the empty tanks behind us. At what point do these tanks figure into this equation?
So we start in that small tank. As you mentioned, there's 4 larger ones and 1 small one. That's called the startup tank. Right as the fish are ready for their first meal, they absorb the little yolk sac that they're born with. We'll put 15,000 of them in that small tank, establish them on food, and as they start to grow and need more room, we move them into more and more of the larger tanks.
Now, you said there's a genetic difference that you can notice between the different rivers. So each salmon that comes out of there has a distinct genetic difference.
Well, no.
Good, because I couldn't follow that one.
What we've done is we have all the parents that we reproduce, the 133 females that you see on the board behind us. We have the genetic information of those parents, hence all the offspring we know can be tied back to those parents if they survive to adulthood, and then we know they came from that river because there's different females that were reproduced in each of the rivers. So it isn't that we can tell genetic differences between the fish, but we can track their lineage through the genetic tracking of the parents.
Okay, so you catch one in the Sheepscot River 5 years from now, and you can trace back to, hey, that was from these parents and this time because genetic similarity.
Yes.
Okay, now I got it.
And if it was a naturally produced fish, if two fish were to mate in the Sheepscot on their own, we still know the historical lineage of those fish and that they would be tied to the Sheepscot River.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what other rivers have we got here? Or is there anything else in this room I should look at?
No, I think we've done a pretty good covering of our incubation room.
We're now walking out of the Sheepscot River room. Chris Domina is manager of this Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery here in Orland, and we're getting a close look at our last best chance to restore Atlantic salmon to Maine's rivers. There are several other rooms like this one on this floor of the hatchery. So which rivers are they? And once these tiny fish become bigger fish, what next? Well, that's next. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. It's Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. We're making fish today inside the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland. Chris Domina is hatchery director. Right now, we're in a corridor lined with rooms, all filled with 8-foot tanks. We've just walked out of the Sheepscot River room. That means that all the fish being raised in there are the spawn of genetically identifiable parents, and they will all be released into the Sheepscot River. If one is retrieved from the river years from now, genetic testing will show if it is one of these hatchery fish. We will know who the parents are. There are other doors down here going into other rooms. Chris?
So we have 7 other incubation rooms, and the other rivers that we have are the Pleasant River, the Denny's River, the East Machias River, the Narraguagus River, the Machias River, and the Penobscot River.
Mm-hmm. And all the rooms are going to be pretty similar to the Sheepscot room that we just walked out of.
Yes.
Okay, so no big need to look at that.
No, we can move down to where the adults were kept.
Yeah.
We took all the eggs from these adults.
Okay, that was my next question, I guess, is you've got these parents, you've got their eggs. What happens to them?
So the unique thing with Atlantic salmon, which is different from Pacific salmon, is that they don't all die after they spawn. So they can live to be quite old and reproduce several times. So all the fish that we've spawned, we've actually stocked back out in the river. And today, the last trip to the Sheepscot, with about 250 fish or so, was to stock those fish back out in the Sheepscot.
So they come, they do their duty, and they get released back in.
They do.
Oh, good for them. Stud fish.
So the fish that we're looking at in these large tanks are fish that were not ready this year. They didn't mature to the point where they were ready to reproduce. We typically have 4 or 5 different age classes of fish on station at one time. The way we manage the 6 down east rivers is each year we capture young par from those rivers, bring them here into captivity, get them established on food in the hatchery environment, and then keep them till they mature or get old enough, which is typically at 3.5, 4.5, or 5.5 years old. And we reproduce the fish once, and then the fish go back to the river and the cycle continues.
Once again, we're in a different room, but this is also a Sheepscot River room. This one has the big tanks for the adults. It looks like you've got water in 2 of them. These fish appear to be in the average 17, 18 inches long. These are adults or what?
These are adults, but they all mature at a little different rate. So these adults that we're looking at just weren't ready to reproduce this year.
So there's actually 6 tanks of this size in here. Only 2 of them have water at the moment. Is that because things are slow right now? Is there a seasonality to it, and sometimes all these are filled?
Typically we'll have up to 4 filled. You can see the 2 that are wet and they're empty. Those had the adults that we utilized this fall and stocked out this morning, so that's why these 2 are empty. We'll put our younger fish from there's another building where we house the younger fish. Those will be moved over here in the spring of the year. They have enough room in the tank in the other building where they're located now.
Now, in a
So it
tank
is
like
seasonal.
this, there's, I'm going to just guess again, probably in the average, probably something like 50 fish in there.
That's a good guess.
Good
Yeah.
guess? Okay.
We usually start with about 300 for each river, so we're probably down to about 50 in that year class.
Okay. When you concentrate that many fish in one place, there's also the danger of passing along disease.
There is.
What do you do about it?
So we go to great lengths with our biosecurity measures here at the facility that we've isolated each of the 7 rivers that we keep here separate from each other. So if a disease was to break out in the Sheepscot River room or where we house these fish, it would not spread to any of the other 6 rivers. We could keep it isolated in here. The other protocols that we go to is we have a water treatment plant, so all of our incoming water is UV irradiated to try to prevent disease, where, as you said, they're in a large congregation together. And it goes through a set of sand filters to help purify the water.
So are there any chemical purifiers in this water the salmon is swimming in, or that water's already been treated before it got here?
It's already been treated before it got here, but it's without the use of chemicals. We use just the sand filtration and then UV exposure, which helps kill any bacteria in the water, which could cause disease on the fish.
Now there's the obvious problem of you get all these fish concentrated together and they're pooping. You have water treatment coming in. Do you have water treatment going out?
We do. We are one of the few federal facilities that has a wastewater treatment plant. Our wastewater treatment plant is a very extensive building which does quite a bit of treatment, same as the incoming treatment. We're trying to remove all of our solids from the waste stream, and we also UV the water again to try to prevent any diseases from leaving the hatchery if something was to be in the hatchery.
All the water from here came out of Craig Pond, or?
We can use 2 sources of water for the incoming water, which is either from Craig Pond, as you said, or Alamoosic Lake. We can actually pump the water from Alamoosic, which is what we're doing now, into our treatment plant, and it's sort of like reusing it because that's also where our wastewater goes into Alamoosic.
Okay. I don't know what else you would like to show me, but we can walk in that direction, and you can explain to me how this facility came to be, what's its history, how long has it been here?
So a little history of the facility is that this facility was established in 1871 as a federal fish hatchery. So we're just past 125 years of trying to restore salmon in the state of Maine. Basically, without the facility here, we probably would see a extinction of the Atlantic salmon in North America or in Maine. So we feel what we do is pretty important to the success of the salmon's future.
Would it be possible to take salmon from the Miramichi, take their eggs or bring them down here, raise them as well, and then get them to imprint in our own local rivers? Could you do that kind of restoration?
You could. And over the history of Atlantic salmon restoration, there's been attempts to use eggs from other sources or start new populations in rivers that were completely extirpated by going to other rivers that have existing populations. I guess just the current thinking is to try to maintain the diversity and genetics of the populations that already exist in the rivers, so we try not to interfere with that by mixing from other rivers any more than is Mother Nature tries to do.
Now, Mother Nature's also accused sometimes of mixing up those genes on our own out there, especially with escaped farm-raised salmon. How much of that do you have to deal with at a hatchery?
So the screening that we do, depending on which river we're discussing, but our screen for aquaculture escapes, and we do try to prevent those from getting into our populations. So anything that would come back as non-North American strain, once the genetics are read, if it was proven to be from aquaculture or European strain fish, those would be culled out and we wouldn't reproduce those fish. We also go to lengths on the Penobscot River, which is the river that we manage by capturing returning sea-run adult fish. We screen all those fish for infectious salmon anemia. We actually take a blood sample of all the fish, keep them in quarantine, and make sure that the fish haven't been exposed to that disease.
So if you find one that looks like it's genetically farm-raised and you're going to cull that one out, who gets to eat it?
Well, usually that's one of the field people that gets the first line of seeing it, but it wouldn't be here.
Okay, is there anything else in this particular neighborhood?
Well, it's just 5 more rooms that are identical to this, so we could actually go to a different part of the facility to look at some of the other stuff that we have.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
We're heading outside. You better put on a coat. Chris Domina manages the Brook National Fish Hatchery. So far in the show, we've been in the main building that houses much of the hatchery and all of the offices for other biologists of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are more buildings on the far side of the parking lot and down closer to the lake. That's where we're going. So follow along or meet us there in about 3 minutes. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Maine was once home to millions of Atlantic salmon. But we dammed up the rivers, blocking access to spawning grounds, and the fish all but disappeared. If there's any hope of bringing them back, it starts right here. We're at the Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland, where they make a lot of baby fish. Chris Domina is the manager. He's showing us around. So, how long have you been here, Chris?
Well, I've lived on site since 1992. The first 15 years I was in Maine as a biologist, I worked over at the Green Lake Fish Hatchery, and I came here as the manager in 2008.
Well, you said this is one of the few federally owned hatcheries that have the wastewater control. Does Green Lake?
They do not. They do not have a water treatment plant. They actually have settling ponds and a different setup than we do.
Do they do the same thing, or is their mission different?
Their mission's a little different, and they produce a large amount of smolts. They produce about 1 million fish a year, and they release about 550,000-year-old smolts into the Penobscot, and about 350,000 par every year. So we're more of a broodstock facility, and they're a smolt production facility.
We're walking to another building. We've just crossed a stream. It's actually not a bad day out here today.
No. So the stream, as I said earlier, the hatchery's been here since 1871. Some historical areas where they used to raise the fish was right there in the stream. They actually just dammed up different parts of the stream, and they kept fish in there. So it's a little nicer to have the environment inside to take care of the fish and not worry about predators that they used to in days past.
Like predators would be birds?
Birds, yeah, otters as well, mink, anything that likes to eat fish. Certainly eagles and ospreys. And
geez, I would think at certain times you'd have a big cluster of eagles and ospreys here just waiting
to get a meal.
Yep.
So this building that we're about to go into is what we call the receiving building, which is where we start the broodstock here at the facility each year. As I said, we go out to each of these 6 rivers and capture young fish by electrofishing.
So you put down electric shock, they float to the surface?
Yes. Always sounds a little scary with electricity and water, but we have backpack shocking units, which sends a small electrical current into the water and temporarily stuns the fish so we can capture them.
It's like a taser.
Yeah, like a taser.
Yeah. They float to the surface and... Oh, okay. These are
3 to 6 inches long, young par, or the freshwater stage of the salmon.
These guys are jumpy. Every time we make a move, they start.
Very wild in their nature, which is one of the obstacles we have to overcome, is to take a fish that's been in the wild for 1 to 3 years and get it to learn to eat in captivity. So we actually...
you have to teach them how to eat?
Well, they're used to eating the things in the wild environment, bugs and worms and other fish and things, so we can't catch enough of those to do it, so we actually use this freeze-dried krill, which helps the fish learn to eat the fish food, or the pellets that you see in the bag.
It looks almost like brown rice. Yeah,
it's very palatable to the fish and helps them learn to eat, although they're not going to eat because we're standing here watching them, but it's one of the things that we utilize to get the fish to eat in captivity.
So-
and we do have very good success at that each year. With about 300 fish from each river, we get about 95 to 98% of the fish to survive to adulthood here in the hatchery.
So these are ones that were caught and brought here.
Yes.
Okay. And so
This happened in August up until October. It takes us about typically a month to catch all the fish for each of the 6 rivers that we do this in.
considering we don't have that many salmon these days, to go out and catch this many fish must be both a challenge and a unique opportunity.
It is, and the crew here works quite hard and works with our partners at DMR to get that done, to go out and do assessments and to capture this many fish.
Now, when you capture them, this is all electroshock, or
It is,
okay.
for these young fish.
So
Yep.
not netting or anything like that?
No.
Okay. They have big eyes and they're staring up at me.
Yes, they are glad we're not an eagle coming in.
Really. At what point? What point do they get big enough to say, "Hey, that's not a threat. That's my food coming"? Do they look forward to you arriving with food at a certain age?
Amazingly, even the fish that have been with us for 3 or 4 years still remain pretty wild. As when you walk into the larger tanks, they still scatter and try to get away from you. It isn't like they've been domesticated.
Now, obviously, within this blue tank that's about 4 feet across, you were hand sprinkling some of that dried krill in there. This bigger tank, this bluer one, has a bucket hanging over it with something in it that looks like old millet or something. What is that?
So the larger tank, these fish are already established on eating the commercial salmon diet, which is a real high-protein diet made up of other fish and things, and that's an automatic feeder, the bucket that you referred to hanging over the tank. We use timers so that we can try to get the exact amount of food into the tank that the fish need to grow well and do survive well here without wasting the food. The smaller tank that's over here, we kind of is our intensive care unit. These young fish here weren't learning to eat the commercial pelleted diet as well, so they're over here in the smaller tank where we can give them a little more attention and try to use the krill to get them onto the feed.
Now, what can go wrong in this room?
Well, same as all the rest of the facility. If the water stops would be the biggest concern. We do have alarms everywhere to let us know if anything changes with the flow rates or things like that. In our water treatment plant, besides purifying the water, we also add oxygen to the water so that the fish always have a good amount of oxygen and a good environment to live in. We also try to keep our flow rates up so that the fish are exercised, and it also helps them keep them good and healthy.
A river flows, so they get that automatically.
Yes.
You just can't leave them in a tank with no flowage, because what will happen?
Well, they would be very disoriented probably. They like to orient into the current, which helps them get air through their gills. As you can see, they're all facing into the current.
Yeah.
It also, the tank wouldn't clean itself very well if you had a very low flow in it. So that helps keep their environment clean by keeping a good flow in it.
How big will these fish get before they move somewhere else?
So what we do is, these fish were captured, as I said, this summer in August through October, late summer. They'll go through the winter in this tank, and then next spring they'll be a little bit bigger. They need to get a little bigger. We're going to actually apply a pit tag, passive integrated transponder, into each of the fish and take a genetic sample. So we'll do that next spring when the fish are a little larger. They'll spend their second year on the other side of the building, and then after that second year, they'll move over to the large tanks, because in their third year with us is when they should possibly be ready to reproduce.
All this has started to sound expensive.
It is.
How much fighting do you have to do over funding?
The Fish and Wildlife Service has had a relatively stable budget for the last few years, and we've done pretty well.
Chris Domina is my guest. He's the manager of the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland, which is where we are today. We're taking a look at how fish are made. It starts with fish having sex in their own way. We're wandering between buildings again. There is one river in Maine that is treated differently than all the others, and we'll take a look and listen to that in a moment. Plus, This is all a crapshoot. A lot of bad stuff happens to fish out there in the real world, and most will never come back. We'll get to that in just a moment. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. I'm with Chris Domina, manager of the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland. It's Chris's job to make a lot of baby fish and release them into Maine salmon rivers. If not for river restoration and fish hatcheries, the Atlantic salmon would already be gone from Maine forever. And even now, when we stock them into the wild, bad things happen. There's a lot of danger out there, Chris.
There certainly is. It's been an ongoing effort for many, many years, and as you alluded to, there's many parts and pieces of it to the environment they live in the river, pollution, predation, migration corridors to get through the dams and over the dams. It is a large task.
How big is the problem of factory trawlers out to sea?
The part of the salmon's life cycle that when they're at sea is probably where we have some of the lower amounts of information on their life cycle. But we do know that they all travel to the coast of Greenland, and that's where the feeding grounds are for salmon throughout the world, Atlantic salmon. And every year, the United States does send biologists up to Greenland to try to help monitor the North American catch of our Atlantic salmon up there. And there was years where we had treaties with the Greenland fishery to help pay the fishermen not to fish for the salmon, to try to help restore the salmon as well.
So let's say 1,000 eggs are thrown into the river. 15% of those may survive okay. So that's about 150 survive that far. How many get further out to sea? How many, out of that 1,000, how many is going to come back and lay an egg? Any estimates?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at that. We're about to go into the Penobscot area, and I like to look at the return rate of these fish as for every 2 fish that we reproduce here in the hatchery, which should give us 8,000 to 10,000 eggs, we should see up to 5 adults return from those 2 fish that we reproduce.
That's good news.
That's good news. That's through the stocking of the smolts out of Green Lake. The problem is the fish that are naturally reproduced or that we stock out fry from, for every 2 that reproduce in the wild, we don't get 2 back. Hence the need for our efforts here in the hatchery to try to help the population get to that point.
Yeah, there's no chance anytime in the near future you're going to put yourself out of business.
I wish there was, but yes, I think you're probably right. There's several years of work to be done before we get to a status of recovery with the salmon.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that humans have messed up over the years. This is one of them. We used to have just abundant resources, and it went away. So bringing it back is not going to be cheap and easy.
No, it isn't. The good thing is any work that's done with any of the migratory fish in our rivers all helps each of the different species of fish.
There's a loon right in the pond next to us. Do you ever throw him a treat?
No. Hopefully we don't have any fish die that the loon would enjoy. We do, if we do lose fish, which we do, all of our fish we donate to Avian Haven.
Oh, yeah.
They rehabilitate birds, so occasionally those eagles and owls that are being rehabilitated do get a nice salmon meal to feast on.
Okay, so we're down next to the pond. These are really bigger salmon. This is a Penobscot room, so this is different.
Yes, these are all the returning adults that we captured up at the Milford Fish Lift over the past year, and we just completed taking eggs from. Hopefully here in the next few days we'll be stocking these fish back out in the river as they've all completed their spawning.
Yeah, to give you an idea of size, this is maybe a quarter to a third the size of a hockey rink. The same configuration of about half a rink, and it's divided into thirds. Why is it divided into thirds?
So usually what we do in the fall of the year to separate the fish and know who's going to reproduce is we isolate the males on one side of the dividers and the females on the other side of the dividers, and then the middle areas where we're working with fish that are ready on the day that we take their eggs.
Mm-hmm. So when they're divided like that, do they actually have any interest in each other?
They have a lot of interest in each other.
It's kind of cruel then, isn't it?
It is.
It's like a chaperone prom.
We actually have to hang large curtains in there, otherwise if you were to sort the fish and leave them with the short screens in, all the males would end up over with all the females in a short amount of time. So,
well, obvious question, but salmon can jump. Why doesn't one of these horny males jump over that? It's only a foot clearance.
At this point, it's okay because we've retrieved all the eggs from the females. In the pod the tank where they were before this, we actually have curtains that prevent them from jumping over because, as you said, they could easily jump over that. And as evidenced by the large dents in the wall that are 6 feet up, those are from fish jumping.
Holy moly. So these fish seem less nervous. They basically gathered sort of not quite at our feet but close enough, and they're not even really paying much attention to us.
No, they're pretty docile at this point as the fall spawn is completed, and they just kind of like being close together in a large group there as we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. This is probably all adult size at this point.
Yeah, most of the fish that we're looking at are about almost 3 feet long, 8 to 10 pounds apiece, and those are fish that migrated out of the Penobscot as a smolt 2 years ago. They typically spend 2 years at sea. Some of the smaller fish, which are maybe 6 or 8 pounds, are grilse, which are young males, which probably only spent 1 year at the ocean. And mixed in there is at least one what we call a repeat spawner, so it's been at the ocean for 3 years, and that fish is longer than 3 feet and up to probably 15 pounds.
How big would you get in here? What's the biggest fish you could imagine in this tank?
Typically from the sea run fish, we've seen them up to 20 or 25 pounds as a repeat spawner. Some of the ones that we keep in captivity that haven't been to the ocean, we've had them up to 30 pounds.
You ever have a feeling that should be a trophy fish?
That absolutely is a trophy fish. Very large individuals, yes.
Okay. So this is the Penobscot room. You do treat this one differently. Oh, there goes one jumping. What's in his mood, I wonder?
It's like post-excitement of the spawn.
Yeah, I guess so.
So the building that's next to us, I alluded to earlier, that's our quarantine building. So during the season that we are capturing fish and bringing them from the wild, from the river to the facility, that's their first stop. They actually are quarantined in tanks in there until we can get a blood sample and have that analyzed to make sure that they haven't been exposed to ISA or infectious salmon anemia.
How often do you find that?
Well, we haven't yet, and it hasn't been found in the wild populations, which is what we're trying to prevent. It has been pretty catastrophic in aquaculture situations where it has broken out. So we're just trying to prevent it from getting into the wild population.
Today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is coming to you from the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland. Chris Domina is the manager, and we're touring the entire facility right now. We're heading back up to the main building, and we'll peek inside the museum in just a moment. One question that will have to wait a couple more minutes. What is the difference between wild salmon and farm-raised salmon? Inquiring minds want to know. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Today, we're at the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland. Gone are the days when anglers would cluster at Eddington Bend in the VZ Salmon Pool, snagging salmon on their way upriver to spawn. Without this hatchery, those days can never return. Chris Domina is the manager, and we're making baby salmon here today. So what is the difference between farm-raised fish, the aquaculture, and these wild salmon?
Well, probably the biggest difference is the stock or the parentage of some of the aquaculture fish. May not be from North America. They may be European strain fish, and they may have been chosen for growth rates or size. We try to let Mother Nature do all those decisions for us as to who's most suited to survive.
These are all the same species but different strains, or is it a different species altogether?
All the same species, just different strains or river-specific stocks.
So they could interbreed easily without any problem.
Absolutely. Yep.
And what do scientists worry about when it comes to hurting our own wild fishery stock if that interbreeding occurs? Is the flavor different?
No, probably flavor-wise. It just could be if a fish is adapted to a certain environment, which, let's say, in European rivers and streams is much different than here. They're shallower, water temperatures are different. They may be less suited to survive in our environment. So just natural ability to survive, I guess, would be the main concern.
Yeah, another dumb question because I don't know any smart ones.
Now,
But all that farm-raised salmon in the supermarket, that's all real pink. A lot of that has to do with the food they're fed.
yes.
So you cut one of these wild ones open, not that same color.
Well, those fish that we were just looking at, their meat would be very red or pink. Xanthan, which is the ingredient or nutrient that's in their wild food, we can actually add to the commercial foods nowadays and get that same coloration in the flesh.
This is quite the hill. Breathing hard.
Yeah, lots of walking.
Climate change, though, it really shouldn't be this warm. It's been so warm this fall.
It is for November 30th or 29th. So much needed rain. It's definitely been a dry year.
Boy, I'll say. The rivers are awful.
Yep.
Has that affected your work at all?
Our main water source through the summer, which we utilize Craig Pond, is a nice deep cold water source for our hatchery. Didn't get the recharge that it normally does, so the level of the lake is lower than it normally is for this time of year.
How about when you're catching the fish on some of those down east rivers? Was that a challenge with such low water levels?
It was. There was some of the areas where the par were captured were pretty low and bone dry. Yeah, the guys. Oh, there's a puddle with 20 fish in it.
Yeah.
Need that on here.
So this is a visitor center / museum?
It is. When we say museum, we have a friends group, the Friends of Craig Brook, and they had a museum, a lot of historical Atlantic salmon fishing memorabilia, a lot of rods you can see on the wall. They had that all in a building here behind the fish hatchery, one of the original buildings, which we call the Fly House. They had these beautiful displays made and moved all of their museum equipment here into our visitor center, so more of the public could get to see it. So very excited to have that up here.
I wonder how many people in public actually know this exists. I mean, it's obviously it's a fish hatchery. You're not going to be able to do just drop-in tours because nobody's available to lead that. But
Well, we do. We are open basically 7 days a week, some except for holidays usually. So we do get a lot of people just stop in. That of course we're on a pretty busy route here, Route 1 to Acadia National Park. So we get
you're way off Route 1. Nobody can find you down here. There's a sign out there in the road, but who would turn?
It's exactly.
Yeah.
But for groups and things, we certainly recommend calling the hatchery to set up a time when somebody can spend more informed time with the group. But we certainly welcome the public to come in.
Well, a school group would just eat this up.
They do. We have a lot of school groups. We had several spawning demonstrations and tours during the spawning time, and as you said earlier, you go out with the Salmon in Schools program, which is kind of neat. A lot of local schools have incubators where they incubate salmon eggs, and the kids get to watch the eggs hatch, and then they stock those young fish out in the spring. So a lot of the follow-up to that is to come to the fish hatchery after they've stocked their fish.
So if a nature club or a school group wanted to do a tour, what would they have to do in order to arrange it?
Just call here to the fish hatchery, get the main desk phone there, and either get myself, Chris Domina, or anybody in the Rolodex, and we'll work with you to set up a time and go through and do a tour with you.
And they'll get to see everything I just saw?
Absolutely.
Will they see anything I didn't just see?
Well, if it's just a few people that stop in, some of the areas that we went to is off limits to the public. That kind of helps with our biosecurity. If somebody's down swimming in the lake with a wet bathing suit, and we don't want them to walk around through the whole hatchery and spread that around. But if we have groups that have scheduled a tour with us and we can spend the time to be with them, then you do get to go to all the areas that we went today.
One of the things that surprised me a little bit is that in some places I've been where they are stocking fish or working with fish, you actually have to wear plastic over your shoes, or you take a foot bath or something in order to make sure you're not tracking in any kind of pathogen. You didn't do that here.
No, we haven't gone to putting the boots over our shoes, and I could see that your boots were nice and dry, so we stepped over and through some of our foot baths, which helps disinfect your feet if we were to come in to an area where we want to try to maintain that biosecurity.
So if anything goes wrong, it wasn't me.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's it from Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery in Orland. Remember, there is a museum here. You can check it out yourself. And they do like giving tours, especially to school groups. You can get a hold of Chris Domina to set that up. He's the hatchery manager, and my thanks to Chris for my own tour today. Now that you've heard this show once, you can hear it again or share it with friends. All episodes are archived on the web at 929theticket.com. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Doors Equipment, and EBS. We'll return next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket.